The solution is not to take Africans and move them to Europe. The solution is to free Africa from certain Europeans who exploit it and allow these people to live off what they have. This is called the CFA franc, a colonial currency that France prints for 14 African nations, and by virtue of which it exploits the resources of this nation. This is a child working in a gold mine in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is one of the poorest nations in the world. For Burkina Faso, which has gold, France prints colonial currency. In return, it demands that 50% of everything Burkina Faso exports ends up in the coffers of the French treasury. The gold that this child crawls into a tunnel to extract mostly ends up in the coffers of the French state.
The Colonial Pact. Have you heard of it? In 1960, the world celebrated. Country after country across French West Africa declared independence. Flags went up. Crowds cheered. France shook hands and said, "You are now free." And the world believed it. But in the rooms where those handshakes happened, before the flags went up, before the crowd gathered, documents were signed. Documents that most of the world has never read. Documents that France has never voluntarily published. Documents that determined whether African independence would be real or a performance. Those documents are what we call the Colonial Pact. And today, I am going to show you exactly what was in them, what France got, what Africa gave up, what happened to the leaders who refused, and why 65 years later, this pact is still running. Part 1. How the pact was born. France was in trouble. Independence movements were spreading across Africa. The cost of maintaining colonies by force was becoming politically and financially unsustainable. France President Charles de Gaulle had a choice: fight independence everywhere and lose everything, or grant independence on France's own terms and keep everything that mattered. He chose the second option. In September 1958, he organized a referendum across all French African territories. The message was simple: vote yes to our new constitution, and you will have autonomy within what we call the French community. You will have your flags. You will have your leaders. You will have your independence on paper. Vote no, and you lose everything. Every franc, every civil servant, every technical expert, every development program, every relationship with France, and all of France's allies. De Gaulle was not offering a choice. He was issuing a threat. Part 2. The 11 clauses, what the pact actually said. The agreement that followed that, the Colonization Continuation Pact, also known as Francafrique, contained 11 main obligations. Let me read them to you one by one. 1. The newly independent countries must pay France for the infrastructure France built during colonization. Roads, buildings, railways. The colonizer built them to extract your resources. Now, you must pay for the privilege of having been colonized. 2. African countries must deposit their national monetary reserve in the French treasury, not in their own central banks, in Paris. France has been holding the reserves of 14 African countries since 1961. France then uses those reserves, invests them in its own treasury bid to finance its own public deficits. You guard our money while we use it to fund ourselves. 3. France has the first right of refusal on any natural resources discovered in the country. Your oil, your uranium, your gold, your phosphates. Before you offer it to anyone else, you must offer it to France first. 4. African countries must give French companies priorities in government contracts and public tender before any African company. Before any other foreign bidder, France gets first call on the work your government pays for. 5. France has the exclusive right to supply military equipment to these countries, and senior military officers must be trained in France. 6. France has the right to deploy troops and intervene militarily in these countries to defend its interests, not your interests, France's interests. Permanently stationed French troops in bases entirely managed by France. 7. The official language of the country must be French. The language of education must be French. Your children must learn in the colonizer's tongue. 8. African countries must align their foreign policies with French foreign policy's position. 9. African countries must use the CFA franc, a currency printed in France, valued by France, pegged to France's preferred exchange rates, your money made in France. 10. Any country leaving the CFA franc zone or attempting to establish its own currency must first seek France's approval. 11. All of these agreements include secret clauses that were never made public. Even today, France categorically denies the full content of this colonial pact exists. This is what independence looked like in 1960. Part 3. Guinea says no, and France showed the world what happens. One country voted no, just one. Out of all the French territories across West and Central Africa, only Guinea, under Ahmed Sékou Touré, looked at the Goulet referendum and said no. The Guinean people voted against the constitution by 95.2% to 4.8%. Those 4.8% are eternal slave, baby. Just like as we get some eternal slave for Nigeria. It was not a close result. It was a declaration. Sékou Touré stood before his people and said, "We prefer freedom in poverty to riches in slavery." On October 2nd, 1958, Guinea became the first French-speaking state in Africa to achieve complete independence. France's response was immediate, calculated, vindicative, and deliberate, because France wanted every other African territory watching to understand exactly what the price of refusal was. All French civil servants left. All French doctors left. All French technical specialists left. All development assistance was cut immediately. But they did not just leave. They destroyed. Over a 2-month period, French colonialists systematically dismantled everything they could not take with them. The Washington Post reported at the time they unscrewed light bulbs, removed the plan for sewage pipelines in Conakry, and burned medicines rather than leave them for the Guineans. Schools dismantled, nurseries stripped, maps of underground electrical cable taken, maps of water pipes taken. They took the infrastructure manuals so that Guinea could not even maintain what had already been built. France then worked to block Guinea from joining the United Nations. It pressured Western nations not to recognize Guinea and not to provide aid. Guinea was forced to turn to the Soviet Union and the communist bloc for survival. And France immediately used that as propaganda. See, Guinea chose communism. They created the isolation. Then they blamed Guinea for responding to it. The one country that said no was shown in real time, was saying no cost. And every other African leader watching received the message clearly. Part 4, Togo said no. Now what happened next? 3 years later, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo, had watched Guinea. He had watched carefully. He was an economist, educated at the London School of Economics, a man who understood exactly what the CFA franc was doing to his country. He famously said, and I quote, "We would rather be poor but free than rich but enslaved." He refused to join the CFA franc zone. He was renegotiating the phosphate contracts that franc was using to extract Togo's mineral wealth at a price that served Paris, not Lomé. He was planning a Togolese currency backed by the German Deutschmark, not the French franc. Jacques Foucault, the Gaulle most powerful operative for African affairs, the man who ran French shadow empire on the continent, said of Olympio Opole, "Sylvanus Olympio was not one of our friends. With him, my relations were never as cordial as those I had with Nicolas Grunitzky." Grunitzky was the man who replaced Olympio after the coup. That statement tells you everything you need to know about what came next. At 7:15 in the morning on January 13, 1963, Sylvanus Olympio was shot dead in front of the gates of the United States Embassy in Lomé, where he had sought refuge. He was killed by a group of soldiers, led by a young sergeant named Etienne Nasigbe, a Yard man, a former soldier of the French colonial army who had fought for French in Indochina and Algeria. Eyadaman later became president of Togo. He ruled the country for 38 years. He was a French allied strongman who delivered exactly what French wanted from Togo. That is who we call a slave catcher, if you don't understand. The timing of Olympio's assassination is documented and specific. He was killed 2 days before he was due to formally complete Togo's withdrawal from the CFA franc zone. 2 days. I am not telling you that a French court has convicted anyone for ordering this assassination. No such conviction exists. What I'm telling you is documented. The man who ran France's African policy said Olympio was not his friend. The man who killed Olympio was trained by France. The man who replaced Olympio served France's interests. And Olympio died 2 days before he could leave the system France needed him to stay in. You have the facts. You draw the conclusions. 5. Mali says no, and the economic trap closes. June 30th, 1962. Modibo Keïta, the first president of Mali, stood before his National Assembly and declared, I quote, "The national currency is a guarantee of freedom and an instrument of power." The next day, July 1st, 1962, Mali withdrew from the CFA franc zone and issued the Malian franc, a sovereign currency, printed not in France, but in Czechoslovakia. France's response was not soldier this time, it was economics. Mali's neighboring countries, all of them still inside the CFA zone, all of them still under French influence, immediately raised commercial barriers against Mali. Trade was blocked, economic relations severed. Mali was isolated from its own neighbors who were being managed by the same French system Mali had just left. The Malian franc faced immediate pressure. Inflation rose, shortage appeared, the economy deteriorated. This is important to understand honestly, because some of Mali's economic difficulties were also internal policy failures. Modibo Keïta nationalization program had its own problems, but the isolation was Franc's weapon when you leave the system. The system punishes you by cutting you off from everyone still inside it. In 1967, the Malian franc was devalued by 50%. By 1968, Modibo Keïta was removed in a coup. He spent the rest of his life in detention in the northern Malian desert. He died in 1977. Never tried, never convicted, just held until he was gone. Mali rejoined the CFA franc zone in 1984. The message had been delivered. At 6, the pattern, Sankara, Gaddafi, and the ongoing cost of refusal. The pattern did not end in the 1960s. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, 1983 to 1987. He refused IMF structural adjustments. He refused to pay what he called debt imposed by imperialism. He reduced his own presidential salary. He sold the government's fleets on Mercedes cars and replaced them with cheap Renaults. He vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles in 1 week. He said at the OAU, debts cannot be repaid because if you don't repay, the lender will not die. But if we do repay, we will die. He was assassinated on October 15, 1987. His body was dismembered. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The coup was led by his former friend, Blaise Compaoré, who immediately reversed every reform Sankara had made, rejoined the IMF program, and maintained close relations with France for the next 27 years. One of the reasons why I said democracy is a scam. Go and watch it. 2021, a Burkinabe court found Compaoré guilty of complicity in Sankara's murder. French rules has been repeatedly alleged, but not yet fully adjudicated in court. Gaddafi of Libya, he proposed an African gold dinar, a pan-African currency that would free the continent from both the dollar and the CFA franc. He was funding the African Union. He was building a water project in the Sahara that would have irrigated the entire region. He introduced a better system of government that would give power to the people from the locals. In 2011, NATO intervened. Hillary Clinton's email, later published, showed that one of the undeclared reasons for France's eagerness to remove Gaddafi was specifically the threat of the gold dinar to the CFA franc system. He was killed on October 20, 2011. Libya has not recovered. Part 7. Today, what remains and what is changing? This is not ancient history. As recently as 2019, 100% of the foreign exchange reserve of West Africa CFA franc countries were still managed by the French Treasury. In 2019, reform announcement changed the name of the currency in West Africa from CFA franc to ECO, but kept the euro peg, kept French monetary oversight, and did not return sovereignty. The reserves requirement was reduced, but the system architecture remained intact. The 6 Central African countries, Cameroon, Chad, CAR, Congo, Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, have not reformed at all. Their 50% reserve deposit requirement continues unchanged. Say that again, guys. Do you understand? Cameroon still deposits their 50% to France. And you guys still wondering why a 100-year-old man whose brain is practically dead is still running for election. Chad, look at all these countries that I name here and check their conditions. And if you don't take time, Nigeria will be one of them. Because I don't get why France is not the one helping us collecting tax in this country. And now, in 2025, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have expelled French troops, kicked out French media, cancelled colonial-era defense agreements, seized uranium and gold assets, and formed the Alliance of Sahel States. They are still inside the CFA franc zone. The currency has not yet changed, but the direction of travel is clear. And France is watching. The same France that unscrewed light bulbs in Guinea. The same France whose operative said Onlipe was not his friend. The same France that isolated Mali until his president ended up in a desert prison. That France is watching 3 countries do what Sékou Touré did in 1958. The question is, what comes next? In 1958, Sékou Touré said, I quote, "We prefer freedom in poverty to riches in slavery." In 1963, Sylvanus Olympio said, "We would rather be poor but free than rich but enslaved." In 1962, Modibo Keita said, "The national currency is a guarantee of freedom and an instrument of power." In 1987, Thomas Sankara said, "Debts cannot be repaid because if we don't repay, the lenders will not die. But if we do repay, we will die." They all said the same thing in different languages, in different decades, in different countries, and the system gave them all the same answer. One was destroyed economically, one was shot in front of an embassy, one died in a desert prison, one was dismembered and buried in an unmarked grave, and 14 countries are still depositing their reserves in the French treasury 65 years after independence. The Pact is not history. The Pact is Tuesday, is Wednesday, is Thursday, and the least we can do is know its name. That is what this platform is for. My name is Inye. Know the truth and speak it anyway.